Okay, so this video is about the non-mapped parts of your essay. This is the last step that we have to figure out before we turn your map into an essay. We have to do the parts of an essay that aren't in your map directly. The introduction and the conclusion. So let's get started with that. So first, seen this before, this is just reminding us how we are not revising our essays, right? We're not doing surface level edits, right? We're not tweaking this, that little thing. We are completely reworking stuff, paying attention not to the writing, but to the argument. And so you probably started out with something like this, that first step after the reverse outline. And hopefully now we're somewhere like this or even more complex than this, right? Where you've got yourself a fairly complicated, robust, well-developed map with some objections, with some ARG stuff all spattered all over it and stuff like that. And the next step that we're looking to do is then turn this back into an actual essay. But before we do that, we know this is the body of the essay, right? We got to do the other stuff, right? Right. So that's what we have to figure out here, because it seems like we're leaving out a couple key parts. We got to talk about those. So the first thing is let's ask ourselves the question here, like, why would we need that stuff? I've got a clear map. I've got a clear argument to share somebody. Do I even need an introduction? Is that part of the filler or fluff that gets word count up? Is that something that people need? Why can't I just dive in? Think about that. Maybe even, post something in the comments there. Why can't you just get rid of that whole first paragraph that you usually traditionally write and just dive right into arguing about the thing you want to argue about? Why can't you do that? One way of thinking about this question is to think about if anything would go wrong if you skipped this element of your paper. Right? I think we can agree stuff would go wrong, right? But really paying attention to what would go wrong is going to help us really zero in and focus on the kinds of things that the introduction should be doing, and maybe distinguish that from things that introductions shouldn't be doing, the actual real fluff, filler, distraction stuff, and just get the introduction to do the jobs that it needs to do and nothing else. So one of the reasons why I really like focusing in on this is because probably one of your answers, and one of mine too, is if you don't have an introduction, then people don't know what's going on, right? If you throw them right just in the middle of your argument, then of course they're going to be disoriented. They're not going to know what's going on. And we do not want an essay, we don't want anything that we write to be like a mystery novel where the reader has to figure out what's going on. I mean, unless you're writing a mystery novel, but we're not talking about creative writing here, right? Unfortunately though, I see a lot of this in papers. People who are writing an essay, and either it's the case that when they started writing, they really didn't know where they were going to end up, and so they couldn't write a clear, here's the goal of this argumentative paper, because they didn't know what the goal actually was until they wrote the conclusion and figured out, oh, I wrote a body that said this stuff. I guess that's my conclusion, which is bad, right? You should know before you start the essay, right? Or you should rewrite the introduction once you do figure out what your real goal is. But another reason why some people don't write an introduction that clearly states the goal of the whole essay is because they don't want to give away the surprise. They want to kind of lead people along a garden path, right? Because maybe you think that your conclusion is controversial, and so you don't want to put anybody off right at the start before you have a chance to argue it, and you think that if the reader knows where you're going, they're not going to give you a fair shot at arguing for it. All that's legitimate, especially for real world arguments, right? Where you might be trying to convince somebody that disagrees with your conclusion. So you don't want to really have that front and center in their mind when they're reading stuff. You want to start with the non-controversial stuff, and then like a mystery novel, right? Surprise them at the end with, aha, look at where we are, kind of thing. But in general, bad idea. Okay, super bad idea when we're talking about the school context and you're talking about your prof reading your paper. You do not want it to be a mystery novel. Okay, instead we want to be super clear about where we're going to end up and how we're going to get there in the introduction. Okay, so instead of a mystery novel, the kind of metaphor that we want to think about for the introduction and for the whole essay, but especially in the introduction, is a map to the rest of the essay to be a good guide so that our reader, the prof, knows exactly where we're going to end up so they can keep track of that, even if the path to get there is long and winding. Especially if the path to get there is long and winding, we want them to know where we're going to end up. Okay? Now, there's a couple really important reasons why this is so, besides just courtesy, right? And the first thing is that, look, your prof's an expert on this stuff, all right? So they've set you a task to argue something that they can do perfectly well themselves, that they can do probably better than you. And that's a problem for you because profs are also have been trained throughout their studies to be active readers, just like you guys are learning with perusal, and I'm seeing lots of evidence of it, so it's awesome, right? Is that you guys are collectively, I see lots of examples of students reading through perusal that are asking questions that like 2 sentences later get answered, and that can be a little bit irritating because lots of my comments are just keep reading, right? But that's really good because it shows that you are actively processing the reading and questioning it and trying to anticipate where it's going and trying to figure out, hey, is there a problem that I should be worried about here? And that's all really great. That's exactly how the prof is going to read your essay, right? They know the territory. They are going to look at your essay and they're going to be, just as a matter of course, it's just a reflex for a prof, is to anticipate, hey, if I was making this argument, how would I make it? And that's bad news for you because the prof knows this stuff way better than you. So their answer to that question, hey, how would I argue this, is going to be better than yours. And so what we need to do is stop them from thinking that so much. Stop them from being such an active reader and trying to jump ahead of where you're going to go, because there's always the chance that their guess, their prediction about where you're going to go isn't where you're going to go. You're going to take a different route to the conclusion, and that's just going to serve to disappoint or frustrate your prof, and we totally don't want your prof being disappointed or frustrated at all when they read your essay. Right? So having your introduction clearly lay out, here's where we're going, and here's how we're going to get there, is going to reassure your prof and is going to tend to make them less of an active reader, less of a predictive, anticipatory reader about where you're going to go, because you've reassured them, oh, don't worry, I have this on lock. We're going to end up here and I'm going to go this way, right? Then they can kind of sit back and enjoy the show instead of like peering out the window, making sure that you know where you're going and are we going to get to a bad part of town here and stuff like that, right? They can sit back and relax a little bit. The second kind of side effect of that is that it's going to get your prof thinking different things. If you tell them ahead of time, we're going here and we're taking this route to it, then the prof, who's gone over this territory a ton of times, right? Not only are they going to worry less about what it is that you're doing in the territory, right? But they're going to be able to then go, okay, and they're going to sit back and watch you drive. They're going to watch you do it. And so that's going to be, so you're in a much better position now for them to remember your driving skills, for them to collect a good idea of how you're getting places. Basically, when you give the prof a really nice heads up about where you're going to go and how you're going to get there, you're essentially giving them a checklist. Here are the things I'm going to do in this paper. Just like the agendas that I put up on the top of this lecture here, hopefully those help you keep on track and not get lost, right? And it's easier for you to back up and check again. Oh, okay, what I have not on this one because the little picture's obscuring it, right? But I got the number 1 up there. And so if we zipped back to the agenda, you'd see, okay, well, we're still on topic number 1, right? Topic number 2 is this. Good. I know where I am, right? I can sit back and relax. I know, and I can scan through the video and find it and all that kind of stuff. It's very reassuring. It helps you know your place. And for essays, it helps that you're delivering a checklist to the prof instead of them having to decide after they finish your paper, hey, did this person do an impressive job? Now they got to recall all those things and remember good points. And if you're the 30th paper out of 50, maybe they're not doing such a great job at that. It's 11 o'clock at night. They've already gone through 30 and spent 3 hours grinding through papers or something like that. You want to make their job easy. You give them a checklist right at the start. They'll remember that, and then they'll check things off as you hit them. As you hit milestones on the way to your goal, they'll check those off, and then end of your essay, they've got this feeling that they just finished a checklist and it was all check marks, right? And so that's going to give them a really tough time not giving you a good grade because you have just set up the experience of reading this essay as they told me what they were going to do. They set the standards for this essay, and then they met them all. How can I not give you a good grade if you did the job that you said you were going to do and made it easy for me to realize that, right? So 2 huge reasons to be really a good guide. Think about that as the metaphor of constructing your introductory paragraph and the whole essay when you're writing your essay. I want to be a good guide. I don't want my reader to get lost at all. I want them to know where we are at every point and why we're there, because we're half the way to the goal, half the way to the destination, right? So if you think of yourself as being a good guide, right? A tour guide, taxi driver, something like that, where you don't have GPS or something, you're in a strange city or something like that, you want a reassuring tour guide or a reassuring taxi driver, right? And so they're going to tell you, okay, you told me we're going to go here, here's where we're going, and here's how I'm going to get there, right? And especially, maybe not so much for like if you're in a foreign land where you don't know any landmarks and stuff like that. If it's a place that you know well, right, then the cab driver telling you, okay, I know where that is, it's by this place, and I'm going to take this route to it, that's going to reassure you that this guy's not out to scam you and take the long route around and charge you up on the ride, that kind of thing, right? So that's the kind of good guide we want to be. We want to share where we're going, right? And for essays, where you're going, that's the thesis, right? That's the goal of the essay. And then we want to make sure, being a responsible guide, and make sure that we can get our passenger to relax and enjoy the ride and look at the scenery and appreciate the trip, right? Tell them the major events that are going to happen, the major twists and turns. And for the essay, that's the major reasons or objections that you're going to talk about on the way to supporting the thesis, right? And kind of the third thing that you're going to do is you're going to give them specific directions as they happen during the trip, right? Oh, okay, we're going to turn off here, we're going to take a right here. This is being really kind of explicitly reassuring and verbose as one of those cab drivers who talks a lot, right? Those first 2 things, that's what's going to happen in the introductory paragraphs. And then this last thing right here, the specific directions as you need them during the trip, that's going to be transition sentences. We'll talk about that in the next video in more detail, right? But these are 2 jobs that are going to happen in our first paragraph. We need to share our thesis, the goal of the essay, and we need to give them, the reader, some idea of how we're going to get there. All right, the major twists and turns on the trip, especially if it's a twisty and turny trip, right? If it's not so twisty and turny, if it's basically just, we're going to hop on the interstate and we're just going to go, right? Then you don't really need much of a plan other than just mentioning, yeah, we're going to hop on the interstate, right? Because especially they know the territory, they know enough. You tell them, yeah, we're going to take the 287. Okay, done. Right? But there is a third job that we want to do, don't need to do, but want to do in our introduction. And that is answer the question, why are we doing this? Why am I writing this paper? Now, of course, papers are all built on a lie, right? We've got the 2 layers, right? We've got this is a persuasive paper where I am trying to persuade you of a particular point, right? That's the lie, right? Because of course your prof is unconvincible on that score. They know the material way better than you, right? And then there's the other layer, which is, no, wait, this essay is for me to show off my understanding of the topic, right? So I'm trying to persuade you of something completely different, not the thesis at all, but that I have understood significant amount of course material and deserve an A for this, right? So the third job is going to address both of those points kind of simultaneously. And the third job is context, right? One of the things that we want the introduction to do is give the reader some context. Your job, your thesis is this really specific. I have this point of view. I have this position that I want to support, right? But one of the things that we want that introduction to do is present that job, present this trip as something worthwhile to do, right? Are we going there just because, no reason? That's not very satisfying, right? And you can't say, well, I'm doing this for an A. That's not a really good context, right? What the prof wants to see is that you can supply, you can invent, you can create, you can haul out of your own butt a motivation for talking about what you're going to talk about in the real world, okay? Because that's going to reassure them that you know how the piece of knowledge, that area that you're talking about in your essay, fits into other things. And that's, of course, an important part of communicating your expertise to your prof. So you want to do that, okay? So for real life writing, we would call this the hook, right? You're giving a reader a reason to read. You're giving them some stakes. The third job, one of the important jobs of an introduction in the real world, is to tell the person who's reading why they should care about this trip that you're going on, why this destination is important for them to reach, why it's important that they follow you along to the destination so that they can believe the conclusion too, right? Because they don't have to read what you just wrote, so you have to give them some reason to keep reading. But again, for school, contractually obligated to read it, I don't need a hook, but the thing that I want is really similar to a hook, and that is, I'd like to see some context. I'd like to see you be able to appreciate the significance of this really narrow topic that is like 1/5 or 1/10 of what we've talked about in the course so far. Like it's 1/5, 1/10 of the readings. It's just one chapter or whatever. But I want to see that you're able to see how this is important in a larger picture. Okay? So, in summary, the introduction has to do these three jobs. Just these three things, that's it. Just do them. That could be 3 sentences. Short sentences. Maybe less. Okay? Depends on the length of the essay. So, usually they happen in this order, right? So first you have some warm-up, that context stuff, where you're sending the prof some messages that you know the significance of the topic, the impact of this academic subject, this academic issue to other academic issues, to real life events or interpretations of things, right? Something, anything to connect that topic to other issues, just so the prof knows that you're able to do that, that you're able to connect stuff from the class to other outside things, right? Second thing, we need to share that thesis, and it needs to be clear and obvious. And I've got an example on the next slide. You're going to see how clear and obvious I want it to be, because often the problem is in the warm-up here, and sometimes in the plan, you're going to say some stuff that a reader could think is controversial. And that's usually what we use to identify the thesis in an introductory paragraph. What's the most controversial claim here? But if you have controversial claims here or here, then the thesis could get lost. And then it's not clear, what's your real goal here? They might not really be able to pick it out. And that can be a huge problem. So we want to make totally sure, short of bolding and underlining our thesis statement, that they know exactly what the goal of our paper is. Okay? And then the third thing, a plan. A brief highlight package, anticipation, foreshadowing to set up that checklist of things that you're going to do in the paper that you want your prof to notice and remember and tick off, so that by the end of the paper they have that feeling, job got executed exactly as they said it would, and they did it well, got to give them an A. All right? So here's my example. So let's read it. I worked this summer for $9 an hour as an office assistant. My parents had entry-level jobs that paid them just as well 25 years ago. America hasn't increased minimum wages nationally for 60 years. In this paper, I will argue that minimum wage should be $15 in urban areas and $10 everywhere else. I'll address why this makes good economic sense, why it won't hurt the economy as much as many people think, and how it will have positive impacts apart from better paychecks. Okay, so I think this is excellent because I wrote it, right? But the important thing I want to show is how it does these three jobs. First, the warm-up up there. Starting out with just a personal story, right? There's facts in there. Some of those things might show up as actual arguments in my body, but that doesn't matter. I'm not jumping into this is not me starting to argue. This is me setting the stakes or setting the context, the situation, the significance, okay? This is my attempt, totally made up. I lied. That's not me. I didn't have a $9 an hour office assistant job. My parents didn't have those kind of jobs. Lie. Doesn't matter. But hopefully you can come up with something that's actually true. Doesn't matter. You just want to find something to say here that kind of introduces the topic in general and communicates how your paper, the thesis you're going to be arguing for that you haven't even told them quite yet, kind of fits in to what's going on here, right? So all I'm trying to communicate up here is this idea that minimum wage hasn't changed in 60 years, and I'm trying to paint a picture of that, okay? And that's prepping my actual thesis. Minimum wage should be $15 in urban areas, $10 everywhere else. Now, as an aside, I think that's a nice specific thesis, right? It's not the minimum wage should be higher, right? It's got some nuance, it's got some detail. That thesis right there promises your reader there's going to be some good stuff going on here. That's not super easy to back up. They're going to have to go into some detail on some stuff. It's good. A prof is going to like that. So you're on the right, you're off on the right foot here, which is really good. But the part I want to really draw your attention to is the stuff in white. That's not part of the thesis, but it's this big neon sign. Thesis is coming. It's right here. And that's super important, right? And I think it's maybe clumsy. You might think it's too obvious, but I love explicit statements like, in this paper, I will argue that. If you're a major right now and you've been taking major courses and reading academic papers from people in your field, you take a look at their abstract, you take a look at the first paragraph of one of their papers from a journal, they're going to have something like this, okay? That's an expectation that profs have when they're communicating research professionally to one another, because profs have to read a lot. They don't have a lot of time. They need stuff like that. In the business world, this is what we call an executive summary, right? Or the subject line or the elevator pitch, right? You have to get the message, at least what I'm aiming for across, and it has to be obvious so that they have an idea of what's going on so that they can choose to listen or to not listen, right? And so I am a huge fan of super specific and obvious signs like that saying, this is the thing that this essay is about. Okay? If you're any subtler than super obvious like this, you run the risk of having the reader misunderstand you and pick some other claim in here as the thesis and then get confused halfway through. They're talking about that. And then if that happens, they haven't been running with the checklist. They haven't been noticing everything because they thought you were heading somewhere different, and now they have to recalibrate, right? And then the plan, right? I'll address why this makes it so I'm talking about it's got good economic sense. This is a little hint that I'm going to be dealing maybe with an objection from people who say this is going to hurt the economy, right? And then another reason here where I'm talking about maybe non-economic social impacts, dignity impacts, I don't know, something like that. But you at least get some idea of what those things are. This is actually a pretty extensive plan. Like it's pretty detailed. I could just as easily get away with, saying something pretty vague like, popular objection to my plan, right? No detail in that plan, but I told you 2 and I told you 1. And so the reader is going to know, okay, I'm anticipating 2 main reasons and 1 objection. So that's enough for a checklist for them to check things off, especially if in the body, you have nice labels to remind them, okay, my first reason is this, my second reason is this, the big objection is that, job done. They haven't got lost on the trip at all. Okay? This to me is the kind of ideal introduction that you should all have. It's short. It doesn't need to be any longer than this. Just get in, get out, do the job. Okay? Remember, when we're writing our after essay, word count, if you had a word count for the before essay, it doesn't matter for the after essay. I don't expect you to meet the same word count requirement for the after essay you write for me that you had to read for the before essay. So be efficient. Be short if you can. All right? Okay. Shifting gears, conclusions. I'm going to go through the same kind of thing here. Do we need conclusions? What would go wrong if I had a nice introduction and then I communicate my argument and then I just stop? Would that be bad? Maybe it wouldn't, right? Like, the introduction is good because you want to prep the reader. Hey, here's what's coming. Here's where we're going. Conclusion, do you need that? I get an awful lot of feedback from students that the conclusions are like the hardest paragraph to write because it feels so repetitive and redundant. Maybe it actually is repetitive and redundant. Maybe you don't need one at all. Maybe you can just stop. I mean, that's going to feel maybe uncomfortable or unfamiliar. But is it wrong? Think about that. Maybe comment. Tell me what you think about that. We really have to, just like the introduction, just like every other part of the essay, right? What jobs is it supposed to do? Why those jobs? Are they really necessary? What's a conclusion supposed to do? It's supposed to wrap things up. Does it need wrapping up? If it's a 3-page essay, do you really need to go over everything again? Prof does not have a memory of a goldfish, usually, right? They should be capable of remembering 2.5 pages of discussion and not having it all reiterated in a paragraph for them, right? This all seems, that's part of the reason why often writing a conclusion seems awkward, right? Think about the real job of an essay. The real job of an essay is not to convince the reader because the reader's your prof and they're unconvincible because they already know the right answer or they know their answer and they think it's right. So if in the real job of an essay, which is to convince my prof I have a deep understanding of this topic, what jobs should a conclusion do to help drive that point home, to help convince them? Right? The conclusion is my last paragraph for 2. It's my last shot at convincing the prof that I deserve an A. What kinds of things can I do in that conclusion to accomplish that aim? Right? I think conclusions, for the most part, are necessary. They don't have to be long, just like intros. Maybe even just a sentence. Maybe just one relatively short sentence. But they're one last chance for us to drive the point home to the prof that I'm not this type of person, I'm this type of person. I'm not some amateur who's just dumping information on you. I am, at least to some degree, an expert, or I'm gaining expertise, and I have organized my thoughts and I have a picture and I know where stuff fits, right? It's one last chance to impress the hard to impress prof who already knows everything, that at least on some level I'm catching up to them. Right? So how does a conclusion do that? Well, spoilers, it does pretty much the same 3 jobs as the intro, but they're just a little bit different because they're in the back end of the essay where you've already done the body of stuff, and they're kind of usually in reverse order to the way that we presented them in the introductory paragraph. So you start with a summary or reminding the reader of the plan, right? So this would be a really excessively polite and courteous tour guide, right? You get to the destination, you don't really need them to remind you about the route they took, right? But that would be super reassuring, right? Just so that you know that they weren't trying to scam you out of taking you the long way and charging you extra, right? But we don't want to just go through pedantically, here are all the places we went, here's how we got here again. Instead, you want to think of it like highlights. What are the key things on reflection now that I want to remind you of so that you don't forget, right? I gave you that checklist to start, right? Some of those things I can rest assured that you, the reader, have paid attention to in the checklist. But here's my shot at trying to tell you, don't forget this part. I did this, right? Because remember, they're probably reading a dozen or two other essays from other students on the same topic. So if you want to help them distinguish what you said from what other students said, because of course you're doing one of the better jobs there, right? You don't want them confusing what you did and what you chose to write about, how you chose to get to the conclusion you got to with what other people wrote, right? So you want to give them a little highlights package, right? But you want to be really don't spend too much time on this, right? Because seriously, if it's a 3-page paper, I don't need that much reminding. I remember. It was 5 minutes ago, me reading that stuff. I remember what you wrote. Especially if it was well organized at the start, I don't need reminders at the end, right? The trickiest part, you probably have to restate the conclusion, right? But probably we can phrase it a little bit differently than we did in the intro, because we have now the advantage of reflecting back on how we got there, right? And during the discussion in the argument, we might have given ourselves some kind of extra resources, some different language to use, right? A different perspective on the conclusion that we can then use to talk about in the intro. So it's not super repetitive, but it might just have to be kind of repetitive. That's okay. If you read academic papers in your discipline, you'll see in their conclusion, they're repetitive. They're just trying to drive home the point, right? They're trying to make sure, because often their papers 15, 20, 30 pages long with diagrams, stats, and stuff like that in there. They want to make sure that you don't forget, right? This is what we were talking about, because my paper's got like 5 parts. It's this big, complicated argument. Your essays are probably shorter and easier to follow than that, but generally speaking, yep, you have to restate the conclusion. And then the last thing, again, some context, right? This is the last time to impress the prof, distinguish yourself from the other students and say, no, I know how this relates to a wider world. This thing that I just finished talking about, this pretty specific thing that I just finished talking about, I know how it links up to other things of concern to us, right? So some kind of what's next commentary, right? Okay, so you're sold on what I just told you here? Okay, so if you believe this, then here's the next fight, or here's the next thing to go research and get yourself convinced of, or here's the next, I've answered this question, what's the next big unanswered question that now we need to research? Now that I have this answer in my back pocket, what's the next thing we need to go out and learn, right? Or you zoom out from that really specific subject or issue or concern to reassess the impact of believing your conclusion, right? So, hey, I convinced you that, the $15 is good as a minimum wage. What's the next thing on? Do we need to talk about universal health care now? Basic income, do we need to now change some other employment thing? Or if we do $15 minimum wage, do we really need unions? Something like that, right? Something that adds some perspective. It's the last chance for you to impress the prof that I have some perspective here. I wasn't just focused on this thing. And then the other thing that the warming down could do is this is a place where we could put in some of our G answers, some of our reflections on the quality of our argument, right? We can talk about how strong particular things are. We can talk about which audiences are going to be particularly persuaded by the way that we decided to argue for this. All of that stuff isn't going to be negative, right? You're not really critiquing your paper in a negative fashion. You're giving some meta commentary that is helping your prof understand this person knows this argument so well that not only are they doing a good job, but they know why they're doing a good job and they know what a good job is, right? So all 3 of those things, kind of the reverse of the intro, tweaked because they're in the conclusion. So here's an example, same topic, okay? And again, I got the stuff in white here, not part of the thesis, but clearly signaling this is my thesis, right? So I've argued that minimum wage should be far higher than it is now, indexed to COLA. Okay, so I rephrased it differently. I didn't say 15 in urban and 10 in rural areas. I just said far higher. The less detail here because, yeah, whatever. Think thinking about, do I have to do the 15-10, makes it sound too repetitive. I can get away with just far higher, right? But the other thing that I was saying is sometimes you can say your conclusion in different language than you could before. That's this part right here, the index to cola. So I didn't say it at the start, right? I maybe could have, but I'm saying it now because after I've gone through my paper, I've told the reader what COLA is. If you don't know economics, you probably don't know what COLA is, but COLA is cost of living adjustment, right? So maybe that's a part of the arguments there. I brought that in, and so now I'm adding that in as a new kind of thing I didn't mention before in my intro, but I'm mentioning it here just to kind of, it's still the same goal. I'm just characterizing it a little bit differently just to mix it up a little bit so it's not super repetitive, okay? And then my highlights, this is, so here I said usually highlights, then thesis, then warm down. I broke my rule. That's okay. It's just a guideline. It's not a hard and fast rule. I think you do need all three of these things, but if you think there's a reason not to have one of these, I can skip that, or I can do them in a different order, then go ahead and do them. Just make sure that you know, make sure that's a choice that you're making and it's an informed choice and you've reflected on it a little bit, not just that you're reflexively doing it because that's what you always do, right? But my highlights here, right, not only do most economists think it's possible without harming the economy, that's a callback to my economic arguments, right? But it has significant non-economic benefits too. That's a callback to my social benefits or dignity of work section of my paper or something like that, right? And then here I did two kind of warm down things, right? So one is a reflection on kind of evaluating G, right? That objection that I was talking about, this is me referring back to that. The big problem is the argument against my thesis is very simple. So it's like easy to phrase, look, if we have to pay everybody $15, then that's going to make costs go way up and kill jobs, right? So my biggest problem is that the argument, the objection is very simple and easy to tell people about, right? But maybe, so I'm observing that. This is the biggest problem with my argument, is that it's easy to say the objection, even though in my paper I have hopefully responded and rebutted to that objection very well. Possibly I could remind people of that here, right? But then the second thing I have here is the other kind of warm down, that put it in context, what's next after you're convinced of the point I argued for in this paper, right? But maybe the next step should be to get a bill passed in one state to show the others it works. Why not New Jersey, which has one of the highest costs of living in the US? There you go. So I just wrapped it up and kind of zoomed out from my particular thing, right? And made it, my argument might have been abstract in the paper, all this stuff, details about the economics of it and the costs and the benefits and things like that, and here I'm bringing it home and saying, look, this will make a real difference in some people's lives or something like that. It's just, again, a made up thing. It doesn't need to be argued for, right? Because it's not part of my argument. This is me doing kind of extra stuff and saying somebody else now needs to take what I did here and do more work on it, or think about, now that we have thought carefully about this part, here's the next issue to think about. All right. Okay. This stuff is really tiny, but I kind of had it and I didn't want to break it up into 3 slides. So I'll walk you through what I've got here, zoom in, and hopefully it's legible. Okay. So some of these things I've already kind of talked about, right? So the first set of bullets up there is about the repetitiveness of the conclusion. And so my main thing there is try and think of a way that you can say the same thing as your thesis was in your introduction, but in a way that you can't state it in the intro, right? So in the intro I had minimum wage should be $15 in urban areas, $10 everywhere else, right? Rephrasing, just massaging the wording a little bit. Wages should be at least $15 in high cost areas, $10 elsewhere, right? Or $10 an hour everywhere, up to 50% more, $15. More than that for urban areas, right? Or wages should start at $10 an hour and increase per COLA index. So that's 3 different ways to say the same kind of thing, plus the 4th that I put in here, right? So there's ways to rephrase your conclusion to have it say essentially the same thing, but not be so clunky, right? But that's just a product of experience and rolling it around in your head, right? But maybe in our brainstorming of building your map, we came out with a couple, and so you can remember back to one of those and go, yeah, that was essentially the same thing, it's just a different way of saying it. I'm going to use that for my conclusion. The second set of bullets here is really cautioning not to go overboard with the recap, with the summary of what you just did in the conclusion. It really depends on how twisty the route was. If it's a 3-page paper, your path to the thesis, to the goal, couldn't have been that twisty. You do not need an extensive recap of, I argued this, I argued that, here was my reason for this, and that. You don't need any of that stuff, right? And so you probably just need a really quick one short sentence recap. I've got two. I said it one way here, right? Right here. This is probably the most long-winded. These ones are briefer. They're decent too, right? I've showed how this isn't just about economics and that it won't hurt like the critics say, right? That efficiently covers both my economic argument and my non-economic argument in favor and the objection that I said I was going to cover, right? Another way of phrasing it, the potential downsides are manageable and the benefits are economic and social. Again, I'm doing all three things. I'm hitting all 3 points, the 3 main branches of my argument, or the 3 main parts of my map. I'm reminding the reader I had 3 main points, but I'm being really efficient about it and reminding them just in case they were a little bit sleepy or dozy. Oh yeah, that one too. Right, got it. Right? And then the intro has that context and perspective. Conclusion should too, right? So these are the kinds of inspirations that I had that to make this yellow stuff right here, right? What's next if your conclusion is accepted by the reader? What remains unresolved, right? Lots of times you see in academic papers, we answered this question, but not this one, right? Or we started answering this question, but we need to finish it off by looking at this, right? So do that in your paper, right? Have some G commentary. Have one of those question answer kind of things as part of the discussion in your conclusion, right? Talk about a remaining skeptical group that you think is not going to be convinced by what you just argued in your paper, and then say, you know what, that's an outstanding issue for me. I'm going to have to think more about it to get those people on board, or F those guys, don't need them, right? So examples, we should lobby our lawmakers, we should have challenge our candidates to commit to this position, right? Remaining skeptics will exist, but we don't need to convince everyone, just a majority to get this off the ground, right? Those kind of things. All right? Now, hopefully that was informative and helped you figure out how to write good, punchy, strong introductions and conclusions without wasting a lot of time on them. Recipes I'm giving you here, right? When should you write these? Of course, given the way that I set this up, I didn't let you write them yet, right? These are the last things that you should do after you've done your map, after you know exactly what you are going to write about in the body of your paper. That's when you write the introduction and the conclusion. All right? You write them last. You write them when your argument is stable, when you know what the plan of attack is, because the intro and the conclusion need to recap, need to present that plan of attack that you've got, and you won't be able to do that until you know what the body looks like. So we should always write these last. The map is first, these bookends last. Okay, and because you're watching this, you probably already reached that stage where your map looks pretty good, right? So now you should write them. So that's what's next. You write your first paragraph and your conclusion. I'll take a look at them, critique them, and then once those look good, there's only one last step after this, which is writing the body of your essay from the map that we created.